All right. Hello, Simon. So
Hello.
Simon has numerous awards to his name, including the Critics Award for Theatre, which he's won 3 times, a UK Theatre Award, and awards for both the Scotsman and a Herald Angel Award. He's worked for a wide range of companies across opera, theatre and dance, including National Theatre of Scotland, Vox Motus, West Yorkshire Playhouse, The Traverse, Royal and Derngate Northampton, Pitlochry, Lyceum Theatre Edinburgh, the Almeida, Gridiron, Perth, and Visible Fictions, to name a few. And I had to share the quote that's on your website. It's one of my favourite quotes of any website. Over the years, his lighting has created a Guinness World Record, brought 30,000 people to a windswept Highland forest, and caused reports of an alien invasion, which I think is a fantastic opener. So welcome, Simon. Thank you so much for taking the time.
No problem. Glad to be here.
So I wonder if we just start off with a little bit about you and your background, and basically what was your route into the industry and how you got to where you are now.
Okay. So hello, everyone. I'm, as Rory said, Simon Wilkinson. I'm a lighting designer based up in Edinburgh in Scotland, but working all over the UK and a little bit internationally. My route into the industry, I guess, wasn't particularly typical. It's perhaps an older route into the industry. So I started doing this in like 98, 99 kind of time, just before the millennium. So I'd got really into theatre at school through a local amateur dramatics group, but then went to university and did a traditional university degree. So I did a degree in computer science at Edinburgh University. But Edinburgh has a massively prolific student theatre company called the Bedlam, well, called Edinburgh University Theatre Company, but they run in a theatre that they run themselves called the Bedlam Theatre. And I was very fortunate during my time there that not many other people were interested in lighting. So I pretty much taught myself over around about 80 productions that I lit at the Bedlam during my 4 years at Edinburgh University, spending more time, definitely more time in the theatre than in lectures. And during that time, I had the great opportunity to make a massive number of mistakes. And I think that was a hugely valuable thing, because at that point, there were 2 different strands of shows that happened within the Bedlam Theatre. There were what they called lunchtimes, which happened, as you can imagine, at a lunchtime. And there was one of those each week. And then they had an evening show of which they did 3 or 4 each term. But the lunchtimes, because they only happened once, it was a single performance. It was an opportunity for everyone, for writers, if it was a piece of new writing, for the directors, for lighting in particular, to just try whatever wacky idea that you happen to have in your head at the time. And you can learn why people don't do all sorts of things by trying them and going, oh yeah, that really didn't work very well. But it was only one day, and so it doesn't matter that it didn't work. So that was that's, I guess, as much of a training as I ever actually had. I then came out, started working in the industry and did a mixture of corporates and trade shows. It was the point that Very-Lights had just started to come into Scotland. So it was still the point where if you wanted to use a Very-Light, you had to have a Very-Light technician come out and use those Very-Lights. They were still quite closely guarded secrets. So I did that for a bit, programming Very-Lights, did quite a lot of shows that came through Scotland but wanted moving lights, and started to develop my own design career alongside that. A lot of studio theatre work in the Arches in Glasgow, which was an amazing venue they had no money, nobody ever had any money, but a really great opportunity for young emerging designers to go in and do things. And they used to run something called the Brick Award. And I was very fortunate to work with a young director, Adrian Osmond, there, which was kind of really, I was doing some large scale kind of variety stuff, but the first real piece of theatre that I made professionally was a piece called Lion in the Streets that we made in the Arches that I made with Adrian. And that then led to other opportunities, working in the Byre in St Andrews. And then around about this point in time, or a bit further down the line, the National Theatre of Scotland formed. And the Scottish industry had been very much siloed, and Vicky, who was this incredibly visionary leader of the National Theatre of Scotland, wanted to bring the industry together. And so she arranged these open space events facilitated by Phelim from Improbable, where she got lots of people from the Scottish industry together into a room and made them talk to each other, which we'd actually been terrible about doing up until that point. It was kind of an Edinburgh silo and a Glasgow silo, and they didn't mix much. And during that, I met Jamie and Candice from Vox Motus, who have been a kind of fixture throughout my entire career since then. And we discovered that we really liked the same theatre. We got talking, we discovered we really liked the same theatre, the same types of theatre. We went to see 9 hours of Lepage at Northern Stage, production called Lip Sync. And from all those conversations, they asked me to develop a piece called Bright Black with them, and to work, and then following that development, to make a piece called Slick with them. And that's the thing that kind of, I'd done other stuff before then, but it was kind of stuff that I did, and then the artistic director would move on from the venue, or the designer that I was building a relationship with stopped designing. So there were lots of things that kind of fizzled out, and then the meeting Vox Motus was kind of the thing that led to my career growing to the point that it is now. So that's probably an overlong history, but
no, not at all. That's exactly what I was hoping for. Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, I mean, basically, where possible, I've tried to link all these interviews with. We get like a weekly topic that we're sort of following, and this one is talking about ideas is this week, which is sort of where I'd like to begin, really. And I'm going to go right to the very start of the process. When you are initially approached about a project, what are some of the things that you consider when you're deciding whether or not you should or shouldn't take it?
So, yeah, it's interesting because I think there are many different ways in which you get approached, or at least I get approached for projects. That sometimes the approach will come as a really informal thing from a director that I've got a long history with, who go, I'm thinking that we might do this show at this point, would you be interested? There's then more formal approaches from producers at venues, where it's still very definite that you are the director, you are the person that the director wants to do that show. There's then kind of the blanket availability check, where the venue's casting a net. They present a list of designers whose availability they've checked to a director and go, pick somebody from this list. And then there are ones that are even less director-led. So there are some where the production manager has ended up recruiting the lighting designer, or it's a producer that you have a relationship that's recruiting the lighting designer. I generally find that the further the director is from the process of recruiting me, the more cautious I want to be about the show. I mean, there's obviously also cases where it's a director that you've got no prior relationship with, who's seen something that you've done, or who's maybe worked with somebody that you've worked with, but they kind of still come into the director's driving that forwards. So, so if the approach comes from the director, I'll always try and sit down and talk to them electronically or over a coffee, especially if it's somebody that I don't know. I find everything's easier if it's somebody that you can establish a rapport with quickly.
Absolutely.
What else is there to say on that? Yeah, and I think obviously what the project is. Does the project excite you? Do you think that something you can bring to the project? Who are the other people working on the project? And in some cases, what the money is. I mean, I kind of have a very rough rule of 3, which it's in no way original, and I've seen quoted in loads of different ways. But that you do projects because they excite you creatively, because they'll enhance your career, or because they'll pay you what you need to live. And ideally, to be happy doing a project, you need to have one of those. You need to have 2 of those 3. And I've also started adding into that now, relatively recently, as I look around the industry more and more and see how overrepresented people like me are within the industry. I think we also have a small responsibility to think about whether we're the right people to tell that story.
Totally, yeah.
And I think it's up to you how you interrogate that, because I think there's loads of definition of what the right person should be. But I think it's an important question to ask. And I think that also goes into, is this an opportunity which is actually better for an emerging designer to do than you need to do? So kind of all of that fits into, I should also say as well, I generally find that I'm rarely in the position where I get to make a choice between two shows in a way that I would really want to. Yeah. I think there's kind of, some people see the world as being, well, you've got 6 offers sitting in front of you for half a year's worth of work. Which ones do you want to do? Which ones don't you want to do? What I end up doing actually ends up being vastly dictated by the order that people offer shows to me in. Yeah. And then there may well be something come along that's really last minute that I would have loved to have done. And I would love to do more than something I'm already doing, but I can't accept that because I'm already busy.
Yeah.
And that's a frustrating thing. And I think is another reason to be slightly cautious about accepting the work that you aren't 100% sure about or 100% committed to.
Absolutely, yeah. It's hard, isn't it? It's a real tricky balance between like quantity and quality, isn't it?
Yes.
And you do have those moments where suddenly your diary fills up and you go, I've not said yes to all of these things yet, and then one other thing comes up. And you go, oh, that would wipe it all out. But it is tricky. But when you say yes to it and you sort of move down that process, in those initial conversations that you have with a director, I mean, what are some of the things that you try and establish in those first conversations?
What do I try and establish? So I think there's the establishing things about the show, mm-hmm. and there's the establishing the things about them as a person.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think you want to work out like what's their vision for the show. If they have a vision for the show at that point, sometimes I end up being brought on board for productions where we're developing, as a creative team, we develop the vision altogether. Mm-hmm. But I think knowing what they are like and getting a feeling for, as I said, whether you have any kind of a rapport with them, whether you think that you can have a conversation with them.
Yeah.
I think if sitting down and having a coffee with someone isn't an enjoyable experience, then the month that you're going to spend together creating the show, with a week of very close activity during the technical and production week, that's probably not going to be a great experience either. So I think there's working out whether you can work with them or not, and then working out whether you can deliver what they're looking for within the show. And I think some of that, I'm in the fortunate position now where a lot of the people who I work with are people I've worked with before. So mm-hmm. I know what they're looking for. I also know what their approach is likely to be. A lot of the people who get in touch who I haven't worked with before, I've seen the kind of work that they direct and the kind of work that they make. And so I have a rough idea of what they're going to expect me to deliver.
Sure. Yeah.
Unless it's one of those, we've decided we want to do something completely different.
Yeah. And have you ever had a moment where you're in one of those initial conversations and you sort of go, oh my God, this is so not what I thought this was going to be? I mean, is that something that you can ever recall happening?
I don't think so, actually, interestingly enough.
It's a good thing. I mean, that's great.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's that happening at any stage in the process is that kind of secret terror that gnaws away at me slightly. That moment when you turn all the lights on, I get much further down the process than we're talking about now. But that moment where you turn all the lights on for the director for the first time and they go, well, I didn't think it was going to look like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
the moment where you realize, because I think throughout the whole process, there's a little bit of mind reading involved in lighting design. A little bit of mind reading and a little bit of therapy in terms of working out what people are thinking and what people are saying, because what we do is so hard to actually talk about. Working out what they're actually looking for. And I can remember, I think it was Rob Halliday many years ago talking about working as a programmer, and the fact that one lighting designer asks, right, could we have our breakup wash in blue, please? And you need to know what that means for the designer that you happen to be working with, because one designer's idea of that would be completely different. And the same is true of directors.
Yes.
And certainly with a new director, a lot of it is working out what their language means.
Yeah, there's a lot of it does sort of, especially that sort of example with programs, it does feel very like a, do what I mean, not what I say sort of thing, which is tricky. That's sort of one of the things I wanted to touch on was when you especially like at the white card or the model process. I mean, how do you describe your ideas? It sort of fills me with dread when people turn around and go, well, what are you thinking? And you're essentially talking about something that they just have to imagine for weeks on end until you're in the space. I mean, how do you approach describing those ideas?
I think that's about the chats that you've had with the director before that, almost. So one of the things that I really try and do when I'm talking to a director is work out a shared frame of reference or a shared language around, maybe just around a particular piece. So that might change from piece to piece to piece. And it very definitely varies from director to director. So you have some directors who see everything in terms of oil paintings.
Yeah.
Is this a Hopper? Is it a Caravaggio? I want that to look a little bit like El Greco. So you have that frame of reference. There are other directors who talk completely about colour palettes and films. So like Belleville Rendezvous is one that's come up a few times. Delicatessen, those films with quite a strong sense of style and colour, and that then becomes the thing that you talk about. I mean, films are vastly valuable if you're starting to talk about shadow and sculpting, because all of that film noir style of that provides, I think, quite an easy visual way in to directors who see things in that way. I did a show in which skies were incredibly important, and I found an amazing book called Golden Gate, which is a series of 365 photos taken on one day of every year of the Golden Gate Bridge.
Oh, wow.
And the skies in it are utterly stunning, and every colour you can possibly imagine. So when you're trying to get a reference for a colour feel for a sky in a show, just sitting and flicking through that can be a really valuable thing. And actually, it was the set designer on that show and I spent quite a lot of time going, well, this is what an early morning should be. And
yes, yeah, absolutely.
Because I find set designers in particular tend to have quite strong feelings about site coloration, because it ties so much into the world that they've created in front of it. So having those conversations in advance and making sure that you can deliver because a lot of those more realistic colors are getting better, but historically were very difficult to deliver by color mixing or by LEDs on site. So you actually had to make strong gel choices to achieve them.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we're hoping to cover in the sort of coming weeks. We've got a session on exactly that, about choosing color, and how we seem to have moved into a world where now, because we have infinite choice, we just don't talk about color choices anymore.
Yeah,
it seems to be dropping down the list slightly. We also mentioned as a group on Monday that we've all had that heart-stopping moment when the director goes, now, you know that film, now you've seen that film, of course, and you go, oh yes, isn't it wonderful, what a piece, as you're secretly writing on the back of your hand.
Yeah.
So looking at a specific piece of your work, Bright Black.
Yeah.
Now, this was something that I saw very early doors that totally changed the way that I understood what lighting was in theatre. And obviously it's a show that relies massively, if not almost entirely, on lighting, really, and the sort of the black art factor. So I imagine you didn't really follow a sort of traditional white card route with that. So, I mean, possibly you might have to describe slightly the premise of Bright Black first.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see. Sorry, I'm just trying to see if I've got a picture which actually explains the show at all. Let me just see. I have no idea if this will work.
This
Can I share my screen?
Ooh.
Host disabled attendee screen sharing. No, I can't.
Oh, have I? Oh, I'm so sorry. Hold on.
It's fine.
No, do you think that works there? Try that.
I'll just try that again. Share screen. And then share that. Okay, can people see? Rory, can you see? There's a picture, should be a picture of Bright Black on your screen.
It is a wonderful sight.
So Bright Black was a show that was built around a style of illusion called black art. And black art is an idea where the human eye finds it very difficult to see a black object in front of another black object. So in the image that's in front of you on the screen at the moment, there's a picture frame in the center of the image, which has actually been thrown by the actor on one side of the stage across the stage. And as it leaves her hand, time stops and the picture frame goes into slow motion and starts to take an arc, a really, really slow arc across the stage. When it is about to smash in the floor, it stops, and then I think it reversed back into her hand. But yeah, so it's a magic trick where time stood still for that picture frame. And the whole show, I'll just stop sharing that. So the entire show was based around a series of these appearances, disappearances, levitations. I mean, I've forgotten how many individual tricks there were in the show, but far too many. And every single one of them facilitated by lighting the things that you should see and not lighting the things that you shouldn't. So this is a Vox Motus piece. It's the piece that I was actually talking about immediately after meeting Jamie and Candice. They asked me if I'd come into a room and develop this show, and I don't think I've walked into things as many times as I since as I did in that week. Because when you're in a completely pitch dark room with just a bit of sidelight on, it's really easy to hurt yourself. But so we spent a week, and we kind of spent a week teaching ourselves how to do black art, because as an illusion form, there's a load of really strong rules about how you do it. You light it with soft light, so it's shadowless. You set everything in an incredibly brightly lit proscenium, which both closes the eye and also kills your depth perception. So all of that makes the illusion work much better. But Jamie was adamant that he wanted this to look like a theatre show. He didn't want it to look like a magic trick. So we had to make it work within a theatrical style setting. So the set that we had was a raised platform and some scaffolding poles that people could clamber around on. And that set was devised through, everything was kind of devised together, really. So the tricks were devised at the same time as the set, at the same time as the script, at the same time as the music, at the same time as the composition. Everything kind of all happened together. So you're right. There was nobody ever sat down and said, here's a set model. This is what we're trying to light. And we went from, so in development, we worked out some of the tricks, not all of the tricks. And then it was a case of, here's this lighting rig, which is very much about practicalities. That this object must be lit when it's in this position, but the light can't light these 20 other things that we're trying to avoid.
Sure.
And then it was about taking that and how you then bring sense of art, a sense of color, a sense of sculpting, to something that's completely driven by the technical practicalities of serving all of the illusion. Because if the illusion didn't work, the entire show broke down.
Yeah.
So yeah, very difficult, very different from a typical, I guess, a typical design process, but actually a kind of process that I tend to find myself in quite often.
Yeah.
So I'd say that my work probably kind of splits vaguely half and half between shows that kind of have your traditional white card, final card, plan deadlines, etc., and shows that are just done in completely different ways.
Yeah. And it must have been, if I remember it correctly, it was a tour at one point, I think, because I think that's how I saw it. And that was sort of how I accessed it. So that must be a really...
People only toured it.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Who we're hearing from at some point in this series. But, I mean, that must have been quite a tense relight to hand over, I imagine. You know, it's quite important.
Yeah. I'm not sure how much fun Kate had. Probably have to ask her that. So another of the rules, the great thing, another of the things that makes black art work is distance. So having the audience a good distance away from the objects, because your ability to perceive intensity falls off as you get further away. But we were putting it into little studio theatre venues where the audience were like pressed slap bang in front of the stage. I mean, we found I couldn't sit. I usually sit behind a screen. I usually have a monitor with channel levels on it.
Yeah.
But I couldn't be behind anything for this whole show, because as soon as you had a monitor in front of you, everything worked. Every bit of the illusion worked. As soon as you sat out from that and sat where an audience member would sit, you'd start going, oh, I can see that. I can see that. I can see that.
Oh, gosh.
We spent quite a while working out how to make it tourable. And one of the things that we did, which is quite common on big shows, but this was definitely, well, it was a big little show. But shows on Bright Black scale would never normally tour all of its fixtures and all of the rigging that those fixtures go on. But that was the only way that we could find of making it repeatable in every single venue. So we toured a kind of 2 massive ladder frames, which went on either side of the stage, which carried the entire lighting rig, and then an overhead rig, which carried a load of tricks and some birdies. And that meant that those went in exactly the same place at every single venue in relation to the floor, which meant you didn't have that thing that you end up with sidelight when you're touring a lot, where how wide the sidelight is on the other side of the stage varies according to how far away from the stage it is, or where it is in relation to the stage. We just, so we had, in effect, an exact copy every time we did it.
Yeah. I came from such a small little village and a school with very limited resources, and I remember going to see it, and it was the first time I remember saying to Kate, what are all these things? And she was like, well, this is a top hat, and this is a donut, and all these sort of light spill control things that make all the difference, really, in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, we bullied the hired, so it was hired from a Scottish company, Blacklight, and we essentially bullied them into buying top hats, because nobody in Scotland asked for top hats at that point.
No,
and we went, no, we want top hats on everything.
Yeah, I'm sure they gave you a sort of sideways look. And sorry, go on.
I was going to say, and then I think they sat on their shelves for years, because still nobody asked for top hats.
Yeah, exactly. They're waiting for that to have a little revival, aren't they? I mean, that's obviously a great example of what is now a really long-term collaborative relationship with that team. But if we go to the other extreme, I mean, now when you, as you said, that sort of has influenced quite a lot of how you work. Do you ever those initial conversations when you're with a new collaborator, do you ever find those tricky or awkward at times?
Yeah, no, I think they are often tricky, because I think it's kind of that the two of you are kind of both trying to get the measure of each other. And I think there is, if it's a show that you haven't got yet, there's that slight, I don't, and it's a show that you really want to do, there's a slight, well, I don't want to put my foot in it, but then also there's that process of getting to know the person and getting to know how they work after that, where you don't really know what their views on lots of things are. Some, take utterly spurious examples, some directors have really strong views both for and against gobos.
Yes.
Some directors have really strong views for and against haze.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's all of those things where you're trying to explore how this person wants to work,
Mm-hmm.
whilst also wanting to keep hold of how you want to work as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And do you have any, you might not, but do you ever have any sort of like little tips or little things that you use to try and get on the same page regarding style, particularly style, I mean, and approach during those sort of chats?
I think finding your common reference for the work, for what they like about theatre. I mean, talking about theatre is one way of doing that. You know, what shows do they like? Why did they like those shows? What shows do you like? Why did you like those shows?
Yeah.
Hopefully somewhere in the middle there's a common meeting point of shows that you both like. I think visual things as well, you know, but I think that can also got to be careful about getting too into really specific visual things, because, for instance, director can turn around and go, well, I don't like color very much.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Does it mean that everything has to be lit in tungsten? Does it mean that or does it actually mean that they don't like tungsten because they see tungsten as being warm and therefore colorful? And so, I tend to try and avoid talking about like details of lighting and talking more about, you know, so you went to see the show, you know, what did you think of it? Why did you like it? Films, you know, styles. And I think also the other thing is that we haven't touched on. Some directors just don't care.
Yeah.
And I think it's also important to identify the directors who just don't care.
Yeah.
The directors who just want to be able to see the actors, or just want it to be pretty, and who actually you attempting to get into their head about, you know, what color palettes they like, what they like about this. They're just not bothered.
And do you find that disheartening? I mean, because we've all had the, oh, darling, you know what you're doing. Yeah, it'll be fine.
Yeah.
It'll be fine.
It's not as disheartening as the directors who don't care and then really do.
Yeah,
They're the trickiest.
Yeah,
the ones who spend the entire process saying, you know, whatever, it's up to you what you want to do. Mm-hmm. And then when it goes into tech, have a really specific visual idea of how they want a scene to look. And, you know, which is sprung on you during the technical rehearsal. I find that probably the hardest. But at the end of the day, it's just something you have to deal with it. You have to go, well, I'm sorry, we can't do that now. If you give me a little bit of time, we can create it. Or, you know, we can move on, and then in one of the working sessions, we'll sort that, and then we'll come back to this.
Yeah.
It is what it is. I think one of the things that's quite important to me is that at the end of the day, the buck has to stop somewhere. And, you know, if the director is saying this is their vision for the piece, that is what at the end of the day you are there to facilitate.
Yeah, absolutely. That sort of takes us quite nicely onto the rehearsal process, actually.
Yeah.
And obviously, so much of what we do is about communication. And since talking about ideas is our thing this week, I mean, do you? Obviously, with things like Vox Motus, you must have quite a heavy attendance in rehearsals. But do you feel that you attend as much as you want to, and B, you know, do you find it hard when you are on another job, as we so often are? Do you find it hard to have those conversations with the room?
So I try, and one of the things that I try and gauge in taking on a project is how much time I need to be in the room for it.
Sure.
And a Vox Motus show pretty much is don't try and do anything else during the rehearsal period.
Okay. Yeah.
And there are other shows where, you know, there's a definite understanding that you'll do a few days and then ramp it up towards the end. So I think yeah, getting getting agreement from the director that that's the kind of attendance that they expect. I mean, I think it's interesting because I think what your voice is in the room is another thing that you need to work out when you're working with a new director or a new collaborator. You know, what are you allowed to express opinions on?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So I work with some directors who are interested in kind of views on everything and will actively ask the entire room for views on everything.
Yeah.
And other directors who completely know what they want to do, you know, and you are just there to deliver a lighting design.
Yeah.
And I'm working out where a show fits on that spectrum is, I think, another important thing in terms of chatting to a new director and working with a new collaborator. Yeah, so I try and spend as much time in the room as possible. There's a thing that Bruno Poet said many years ago about you're going to have to spend a lot of time thinking about your lighting plan. So why not spend that time in the rehearsal room? Mm-hmm. And I find being in the room really useful in terms of giving me an idea about how this conceptual space that the set designers produced is actually going to be inhabited by bodies. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And even if I don't get to see the entire show in the room on a particular day, just sitting in there and watching how people are using the space, how they angle their bodies to or against the audience, you know, what role a staircase plays in a production or not, watching how they use the marked up space immediately starts me thinking about angles and shapes when I come to actually drawing the rig.
Yeah.
So I find being in the room really useful.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of. I think it's also Bruno's fantastic podcast. I don't know if you've heard it yet. I mean, they were speaking with Luke Halls about how, you know, what we do is such a 3D reactionary thing.
Yeah,
it's exactly that, isn't it? When you're sat in the room, you really do. And I mean, I personally find it almost better when it's not a full run through that's non-stop, because there's a bit of thinking time, isn't there, that you so often lack at the final run through.
Yeah. It's also a really good time to start seeding, if you're working with a director who will accept it, to start seeding things in that would make your life easier. You know, that whole if they were standing down there, we could do this amazing effect at this moment. Or if they were over there, we could do this amazing thing.
Yeah.
As you start to see how bodies work in the space, you can start thinking about how light interacts with those bodies and start to go, well, maybe if they weren't there and they were there, or if those two people were playing across each other. Mm-hmm. And if you've got a director who's receptive to that kind of thing, it's often easier to feed that in the rehearsal room when people have time to think about it and the actors have time to adapt to it, than it is to feed it in during the pressure of tech.
Yeah. It's also a great, I don't know if you'd agree, but I feel it's a great time to find out if they are receptive or not. It's still, you're still working out, especially with new people. You're still working. Are you going to be receptive to this? Are we trying to, you know, we're all trying to tell the same story, you know. So do you ever find that in you know, I don't know, for a 4 or 6 week rehearsal period, say, those ideas that you go into it with, I mean, do you find that they generally evolve a lot, or are they fairly set when you go in? You know, I mean, have you ever had something that's taken a complete U-turn during rehearsals?
I think devised work, you never really know that if you're going to come out of the room with what you went in with. And I think that's true of the entire production. I mean, my rough approach is I tend to try and build toolkits. And this is a Vox Motus thing that I've taken and carried through to everything else. That Vox Motus think of their shows as being a set of tools that they use to tell the story.
Okay.
And if they're devising a piece, they'll go into the devising room with that set of tools, but not necessarily the complete how they all fit together. And that's very much the way that I work lighting rigs, that I often have a load of stuff that are, you know, like riffs on an idea, or that I think might work well together. But especially with pieces that aren't fully formed, I quite often don't know exactly how I'm going to use all of those things until the technical rehearsal starts, and I start going, oh, that's what that does, and then you start to pull it together from the toolkit that you've assembled.
Yeah. And do you? I did sort of warn you I was going to ask you this one, but I was just curious: is there one thing that when you hear in the rehearsal room, your heart just sinks? Is there anything?
Don't worry, we'll fix it with lighting. Is kind of that. I think lighting is quite often asked to stitch things together, for better or for worse. And sometimes it's definitely for better. Sometimes it can be an amazing tool to join stuff together. But sometimes it's also a bit.
Yeah, do. It's when you hear that, you really work out quickly how realistic people are, don't you?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you were saying there about that sometimes you don't realise until you're in the tech what those things do. Yeah. I mean, if we talk about something like plotting sessions, although the time does seem to be rarer and rarer now to get them. I mean, obviously, it is your time to use as you want, and quite often you do get a director there it's their time to contribute and collaborate with you. I mean, how do you approach those sessions?
See, I don't like plotting sessions.
Oh, good. I'm glad someone else doesn't.
I think plotting session. Okay, so I think plotting sessions, if they're used well, can be a good thing. But I think plotting sessions very often are not used well. So I think any time that you can spend with your board op building stuff that's going to be useful for tech is massively valuable. But the director really doesn't need to be there for that. So like moving light focuses, picking your color palette, which I guess you're going to talk about later, but I always try and know what my color palette is for the show before I go into tech, rather than it being, here's all these wonderful colors. I've generally, maybe it's because when I first started, it was all scrollers, and so you were thinking about color and scrollers, but I still generally try and think about where in the world the color for this show sits, and then we'll sit and build versions of those colors. Generally with the venue operator, or if I've got a programmer, I'll give them a list and say, you mix all of these and then let me see what they look like when they're done. Plotting, and then I think with the director, the only thing that I personally find useful is going through and going, so for this scene, I was vaguely thinking about this, and then saving that as like Q800. And for this scene, I was vaguely thinking about this. So there's kind of just a set of building blocks. I think the old style plotting session, where you sit down with an ASM standing on stage, the DSM beside you, and you attempt to go from Q1 to Q whatever right the way through the show, I really don't find useful, because I think everybody rapidly loses the will to live. And I think the most important element of the show, the costumed performers, are missing from that space. So you're lighting a generally bored ASM, probably wearing a black t-shirt,
and a bright phone screen,
who looks anywhere apart from out front. Pretending to be a company of however many. And I think everybody's attention just starts to wander. Or like it ends up being an argument over where furniture goes. I've had entire plotting sessions where the entire 4 hours plotting session is about where the sofa is on the set. And actually it's wonderful that was sorted before the tech, but let's not call it a plotting session.
Yes, totally. And you do sort of get stuck in. I think you end up devoting so much of your energy to panicking about how much you're going to get through in that, in that old-fashioned way of 1 to 100 or whatever. You just spend the whole time going, well, we need to get to Q40 by the time we do a tea break or something. It's just not productive, and it all changes in the tech anyway. That's why we're there, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think that moment, because so much of the work that I do riffs off, as well as actors and their presence in the space, riffs off what the sound designer is doing, what the video designer is doing, and often those elements don't appear until the tech.
Yeah.
So, and especially because I do very few, I do very few kind of like well-made plays. You know, bunch of people in a box set with one lighting state. Nobody ever asks me to light.
Sure.
Everything that I do is dynamic and fluid and has loads of scene changes and transitions. And you're working out what your language for those is as you go in the technical rehearsal, really, what the lighting language that takes you from scene 1 to scene 2 is I think, a really important decision to make, and that you can only make when you've got all of those elements together. Yeah. And until you've decided what that language is between scene 1 and scene 2, there's no point lighting every other scene change in the show, because you're just going to have to go back and undo them.
Yeah, totally.
So yeah, so that's my slightly passionate view on plotting sessions.
No, I am completely with you, and it's lovely to hear someone with the same opinion. A couple of questions here. So Sam's asked, when working with a director that knows what they want for the show, but what they want doesn't necessarily agree with how you want to design it, how do you work together to meet in the middle and bring both sides together?
So as I said, hopefully that discovery begins from the very beginning. So hopefully the conversation that I'm having with the director. And yeah, that does, in the early stages, that happens really often, that my idea of what a show could and should be can often end up being really different from the set designer or the directors. And I think at that point, I generally suggest what I'm thinking, but if they're being knocked back, I kind of just attempt to reroute my thinking onto a shared path.
Sure.
And hopefully, you know, in a good working relationship, not everything gets knocked back. But I think part of that is about not pitching the same rejected idea again and again and again. It's it's a little bit that thing that I was saying about, you know, us needing to be slightly mind readery, that, you know, part of it is going, oh, that's what you're thinking, so I need to adjust this in order to match that. There was a show that I was doing recently, so this happened in tech, where there were these 2 doors upstage, and every time those doors were open, there were big streaming warm light poured in through those doors. And the director turned to me and said, you know, can we not have that light behind the door, because I need to get somebody across behind it. And so I launched into a big, long description of what my reason for the light falling through those doors was, which was all about that. So this was metamorphosis. So whenever there was somebody from the outside in Gregor's room, the light streamed in. And then when they left, the light left with them, and it was a dark, harsh room again. And so I argued my point. But I argued my point in the knowledge that if they turned around and said, well, that's great, but there's no other way that I can get this next scene set up with that light through that door, I would need to lose the light through the door and come up with some other justification for it. But in that case, the director was completely prepared to take that point on board and went, oh, that's what you're doing, right? Well, that makes total sense. So let me work out another way of solving that. And it was solved in another way. So yeah, I think it's kind of a case of being grown up about it in many ways. It's a case of, you know, being prepared to make your point, but accepting that you have to bend as well. Yeah.
I thought one of the interesting things you said that ties in slightly with the question I'm about to read out is you said, you know, I very much decide my colour palette in advance. And I wondered slightly how you get that across to a director or a designer, which ties in with the question, how do you feel about visualization as a tool for describing ideas? Is it something that you actively use? And if so, at what point in the process would you start to bring it into play?
So I don't at all. And that's perhaps based on, so when I was still doing corporate stuff, I used WYSIWYG a lot. And WYSIWYG was a really handy tool for those kind of lighting designs to sell things. So effectively you do a render for a client and go, here's this thing, but if you spent this much more, you could have this much shinier thing. I think that certainly at that point, the danger of those tools for theatre was that they gave a very particular style of results. So like hard-edged beams, lots of haze, which I always felt were counterproductive to actually, you know, the danger is you either get a director who looks at it and goes, well, it's not going to look like that, is it? Or you get a director who goes, I want that, when actually what you wanted was something soft and subtle. And so yeah, that kind of put me off visualization. The other thing is I completely love serendipity. I love the moments when you're focusing a rig and the light splashes across, a light that's going to do something completely different splashes across a piece of scenery, and you go, wow, that's gorgeous. And in that moment, you completely change everything that you've been thinking about how you were going to do the show because of that thing that you just discovered. And I think if you have got too far down the visualization path, which never shows you those magical moments, you end up not being able to respond to them because you're too locked in. So I don't use visualization. I am, however, quite excited by augmented, because I'm very interested, purely as a tool for me, so not as a communication tool. I'm very interested in ways that we can start building the structure of shows and making choices about like cue structure and things like that earlier than the tech. Because techs are getting tighter. My experience of techs is that they're getting tighter and tighter and tighter. People are making shows that have more and more elements. I'm doing more and more shows that have video in them, more and more shows with very complicated lighting, more and more shows with complicated sound, and yet the time to actually make them isn't growing. So the more tools that we can have to be better, it's that challenge though about being better prepared versus not committing too soon. Knowing when to make the decisions, I guess. Knowing when you have to go, yes, that's what we're going to do, and how long you can put that off for.
Yeah. No, it's interesting, because I think I completely agree with you that visualization generally can feel a bit like double handling, can't it, sometimes? Because you do it and then you get into the space and go, oh, this is so not quite what I thought, or vice versa. But yeah, interesting that I'll be interested to know what you feel about augmented, not as a communication tool. It's quite interesting that it would be a thing for yourself. A couple more questions. Thanks, team, for the questions. How do you establish budgets and then make sure that you can deliver the director's vision for that budget? And if it isn't enough, prevent it compromising on the design?
So budgets are an interesting one. So again, it depends on the environment in which you're working. So I do some shows in which the budgets are strictly allocated silos, which there is absolutely no movement between. And other shows in which there is an overall production budget, which the production manager then manages and allocates to departments according to their needs. So, and they're quite, and also some shows where you're lighting it entirely with house equipment. So the budget kind of isn't a financial budget. It's a budget of how many hours worth of labor is there to hang the rig? How many hours worth of labor is there to focus the rig? And is the couple of £100 that there actually is enough to spend, that's actually there to spend enough to colour it? So, and they're kind of all slightly different questions. I think it's important to be optimistic but realistic throughout. Like, there's no point in pitching to a director, 100 moving light show when you have no budget. And I think actually there's some really interesting. So years ago, I did a rock musical where went into it and they wanted the X Factor style rig, but it was a period rock musical set in the 70s. And I went, well, why don't we think about how they would have lit this show as a rock concert in the 70s? And so we ended up scrounging every power can that was available in Glasgow. So delivered something that felt like a big rock, hot rock concert. Standing on that stage was not pleasant. But and that was a constraint that became a huge amount of the style of that show. So that was about taking the directors, it would be really great if we could do this, and then twisting it into something that was affordable. So yeah, I always have a view on budget. I don't think it's fair to deliver shows which go vastly over budget. I think for touring shows as well, it's really important. Another element of budget is, can we reproduce this on tour? Is there enough fit-up time to deliver this design? Because I also feel quite strongly there's no point in delivering a touring show which looks great in its opening venue and then is unachievable in every other venue that it plays.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think all of those are kind of factors that are kind of off the edges of budget. Kind of straight off the question now.
No, that is, it's sort of how, when you don't have enough budget, how do you start that impacting on the final design and the vision, really? But I mean, that sort of is basically what you said is, well, be realistic. That is
but I think also be aware that there are choices to be made. If you're early enough in the process, there are choices to be made about how things get allocated. So Bondagers at the Lyceum was a very lighting heavy show, which I got to do because set just covered the whole stage in soil. But then I got to have, so we had, for instance, a moving wall of Svoda battens that tracked from upstage to downstage.
Fantastic.
Which we could do because everybody bought into that as a concept. And that was a concept that was in the show from the white card model and costed in from the white card model as being something that we were going to do.
Yeah. There's always a moment, isn't there, where you suggest something and it's usually attached to a bit of set, and there's some eye contact around the room where they go, now, is that your budget or is that my budget? And you sort of go, oh, we'll talk about it later. Yeah.
Yeah. But that was kind of that interesting one, because everybody on the creative team saw that. And the way we approached designing that show was, here are the set of moments that we have to achieve. And some of them are scenic moments and some of them are lighting moments. And actually, we're going to work through all of those moments. We're going to storyboard all of those moments. And then we're going to cost it holistically, rather than going, so here's the set design. 2 months later, here's a lighting design.
Absolutely.
And then all the money's been spent.
Yeah. And sort of on that, on sort of almost storyboarding in a sort of different kind of way. And one of the questions here, any advice on relighting a show, especially when that design is not your own?
I think try and understand as far as you can the intentions of the original design. So rather than where a light is and what the light does, why the light does that.
Yeah.
Because I think then you have the ability to make more informed choices about alternatives if you can't achieve the position or the unit that may have been originally intended.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's big. It's the big picture. What's the dream, isn't it? And how do you?
I was a terrible relighter, so I'm probably not the best person to give.
Take notes, everyone. A great one here. What advice would you give on approaching directors that you haven't worked with but would like to? Do you network with them personally or through their team, i.e. producer or production manager?
Go and see stuff. I think the best way to get in touch with directors that you haven't worked with is go and see their work.
Yeah.
And I think to be realistic about who it is likely to be that might employ you, to find the people who are doing work that you find exciting, to see their work, and then to get in touch with them and tell them how exciting you found the thing that they've just done, and to say, in non-COVID times, do you want to go for a coffee? Do you want to have a chat? And trying to find people who think about theatre in the same way as you do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good opportunity, isn't it, to almost be slightly a step ahead in that common ground you always try and find. Well, if you've seen their work, isn't it fantastic when you can say, listen, I saw it, I loved it, I love the style of what you do.
Yeah. And
then that if it works out, that the two of you have already started on the same page, which is great. you might work out who this question's from. It's not from me, by the way, but having worked in many theatres in Scotland, this person's favourites are Pitlochry and Perth. Do you have a favourite?
I don't think I'm allowed to have favourites. I think having favourites could end really badly.
Go on, what are they? Yeah.
I think they're all really different. Some of them I love. So I love the Lyceum because it's 20 minutes from my front door.
That is a bonus. That is a valid reason to like it, yeah.
I love the Traverse because I think I first worked there in '94 or something crazy like
Fantastic.
that. They are all. I really miss. So I really miss the Arches, but I definitely didn't love it when it was there. It's kind of the odd thing. The Arches was always the Arches for me was a classic example of you don't know what you've got until it's gone, because it was always a challenging building to work in, and it was only when the possibility of working in it wasn't there anymore, you realise just how important to an entire ecosystem it was. I'm really looking forward to the Sits being open again. It's a beautiful auditorium. Perth Theatre is gorgeous coming out of refit. But they've all got little, I love the Byre because that's where I met my wife, but sadly not producing anymore.
Fantastic.
I don't have any real special favourites.
Yeah, they've all got their thing, haven't they?
They do all have their thing. None of them are soulless, which I think is really valuable and important.
It's such a tight network, isn't it? I mean, I appreciate that. Obviously, this is particularly biased coming from us, but it is such a tight network, the Scottish Theatre Network.
I think the challenge is that they're all different. So touring in Scotland is hard because there aren't a similar set of venues with similar stage. There aren't enough venues with similar stage footprints that you can easily make a show which picks up from one venue and then drops down at 10 art centres or 10 number one stages. So you get this really bizarre, even more so up in Inverness, where Eden Court is. It used to be that the only theatre in Eden Court was the Empire, what they now call the Empire Stage, which is this 2,000-seat auditorium, which was designed to take Scottish opera tours, so big opera tours. And it used to be that everybody would take their tiny little studio theatre show and put it on the main stage at the Empire, because it was the only way that you could play Inverness and serve that remote community. So you'd have this tiny show drowning in a sea of blacks at Inverness. No favourites.
Fair enough. I'm going to open it up to anyone. I mean, if you have questions, obviously I'm reading these out, but if you've got questions, feel free to either pop your camera on if you want to ask them, or keep adding to the chat. It's entirely up to you. We're still sort of working out how we're going to run this. We sort of voted against doing a webinar directly, just as it's good to have a chance to chat. Ian, yes.
How did you get to work with? How did the process work? Getting to work with Robert Lepage.
Aye.
Because I'm a huge Robert Lepage fan, especially his last ring cycle at the Met. How did the process? How closely did you work with him, and how did it all kind of start?
Okay. So how it happened was that Jamie Harrison from Vox Motus, who I do a lot of work with, had been an observer. So Ex Machina do a program where anyone can apply to be an observer in their rehearsal room, where the deal is basically you fund your own time in Quebec, but you get to go and be, I think it's for a week, you get to go and be in one of his either rehearsal or development rooms for a week. And Jamie had done that and had got on well with Robert. And the two of them had remained in contact since then. And then I did a show called for Vox Motus called Dragon, which was in the Edinburgh International Festival in the same year as Robert was over performing in the festival. And Jamie and I ended up meeting Robert at one of those random first night receptions that you go to, because he'd opened on the same night as us. And Jamie persuaded Robert to come and see Dragon the next day. And Robert came and saw Dragon, loved Dragon. And there then started to be this dialogue about he wanted to make a show specifically with Jamie at that point. And that show ended up becoming the Magic Flute, where Robert's selling point for the Magic Flute was that he wanted to put magic at the heart of the Magic Flute. So Jamie basically said to Robert, well, I would really like to work with Simon. And Robert said, was he the guy who lit Dragon? And Jamie said yes, and Robert said yes, totally. So that's how the getting to work with him happened. So it was kind of a series of very fortunate events. In terms of working with him, Magic Flute was a fascinating process because we went into it with no set design at all, really. There had been a set design, and then it hadn't really been working. So for whatever reason, the first development I turned up at, we were starting from a complete, we had all of the scenes in the Magic Flute, and we worked through all of the scenes in the Magic Flute, improvising the design for each scene in the show. And the way that Robert works is he works with a team of what they call acrobats, who are basically incredibly talented physical theatre performers who have a long working history with him. And basically, and he has in Le Caserne, which was their rehearsal space. They've now moved to the Diamond, but Le Caserne, an old converted fire station, which has this amazing storage space underneath it that has, lots of things. So that entire process ended up being, right, so here's a scene in Magic Flute. What can we, how are we going to stage this scene? And so Jamie would throw ideas into the room. I would throw ideas into the room. The acrobats would throw ideas into the room. The associates. So everybody, it was kind of this melting pot of ideas. And then Robert would hook on to an individual idea that had been suggested and then work with that idea with the performers. And we spent 4 weeks in total, something like that, effectively designing the design of the show. So there are some bits of the show that are completely lighting led. So the opening of Act 2 with Sarastro, there's this massive glowing globe rises up out of the floor, lighting the assembled priests, which came out of a little development that I was leading on, where we were spinning a light bulb on a piece of string. You know that old trick where you spin a light bulb around on a piece of string and you enjoy the way all the shadows from the light bulb made? Well, we want to do that, but how can we do that on a stage with a 16-meter wide proscenium and 12 meter trim? And the great thing about Ex Machina, the amazing thing about Ex Machina that I haven't worked in an environment like that before, is they just have people around who you can go, so I need something that's like a light bulb, only 1,000 times brighter, please.
Yeah.
And Toby went away, and I think I've got an image of it. Let's just see in my selected set of images. I'll just see if I can show you this, because I think it's a good example of. Hopefully you can see that.
Oh, wow.
So that's mainly, there's a bit of fill. This is actually, so it starts out being just lit by that globe, and I think we dimmed it down for the photograph, because I think the photographer was having trouble with it. But yeah, so that moment there came out of, how do we turn that light bulb into a stage one? There was another moment about how do we build a pyramid on stage? And I foolishly piped up with, well, you do it with beams of light. So we built a giant pyramid with some Sharpie beams, effectively. Mm-hmm. And again, working through the show, there was a point where we wanted to make a Masonic grand hall. And I said, well, they've got these amazing parquet floors. And people went, well, we can't get a floor on and off stage. So we ended up projecting a chessboard floor with 32 very painstakingly focused source fours. And and that was an interesting thing because I just wanted to do a bit of it. This is a thing about directors pushing you. So I was like, well, there's no way we can do a full chessboard. You know, we don't have the size, we don't have the space. And Robert was always about, if you're going to do it, you have to do it right. So the pyramid, for instance, the pyramid had to be the right proportions for the Great Pyramid at Giza. Because if you're going to do a pyramid, you have to do it right. So that chessboard, if it's going to be a chessboard, it has to be an 8x8 square. And the squares need to be big enough that people can be chess pieces on that chessboard. But the thing is, when you keep pushing, eventually you manage to achieve the thing that you're pushing for in that environment. So yeah, anyway, that's Robert and Magic Flute.
Oh. I also saw both your production, both your pantomimes in Perth, and
yes.
I love Perth.
Yeah.
I started at Perth Youth Theatre in 1991, and kind of I've just fallen in love with Perth Theatre. Perth Theatre is one of my favourite theatres.
Yeah, it's a gorgeous theatre. I did some things in there before the refit. I've done a few things in there afterwards. It's a lovely place to work.
Have you worked in the Joan Knight studio yet?
So we did Black Beauty, which is a touring kids show. We put into the Joan Knight studio to get it ready to go back out and tour again, which was a bit of a squeeze because that's a show that kind of played Traverse Swan. It's that kind of, you know, mid-scale, I guess. But putting that into a studio space was exciting. But yeah, no, it's a nice space as well.
Thank you.
No guesses for whose question on favourite theatre was. Fantastic. I have one question for you. Unless anyone else wants to jump in, does anyone have anything they want to ask? Please do pop up. I'll make a start and then we'll see. Sort of what we touched on actually before everyone came into the room about how do you find it. You obviously work all over the place. So I mean, how do you find it living in Edinburgh but working all over the place? Do you find that tricky at times, or?
So yes, it's tricky at times. The amazing thing was working internationally, like working in Canada, they didn't care where I lived because it was an international flight, whatever. And so you just jump on a plane. I think working in the UK, it is tricky being mainly for logistical and financial reasons, being out of London, in that there's a general assumption that, you know, people work out expenses budgets based on how much it might cost somebody to travel to this venue from London.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, so that's a bit tricky. And I think also lots of directors who you might be working with live in London. So a lot of those spur of the moment, do you want a coffee? Apart from the August, in a typical August where the entire world comes to Edinburgh, it can be difficult to make those relationships. But I think there's also, I'm probably not really the person to say because I guess I'm in it. I'm very in it. The Scottish scene has always felt to me very friendly and supportive in a way that I think the theatre scene in some towns or in some areas can end up not being. And ultimately, I ended up living here for family life reasons rather than for professional reasons, really. Yeah. And also because when I was I did live in Scotland, and then I moved down to London. I was in London for 5 years. I moved down to London because it felt to me at that point that what I was doing in Scotland had hit a limit, and that there was a ceiling that I was banging against where all of the main house venues were saying, well, we don't want to take a chance on somebody who's not lit a show in a main house venue.
Right, okay.
So it felt like I was trapped in a little, that nobody was going to give me a main house show until I had a main house show. So I moved away, and then pretty much moving away was the catalyst for loads of offers coming in to do shows to do shows in main house venues. So it suddenly felt that I took that step up for reasons that I don't entirely understand.
That's really interesting, because I'm sure that some of us in this call will feel that that's a thing, even if you are down here. So it's really interesting that when you moved away from what you thought was holding you back, as it were. Because we've all had it where somebody goes, we want you to, no one will let you light a commercial musical unless you've lit a commercial musical.
Yeah.
And you go, well, how do you get around that? That's
No, so I don't know entirely what made that shift happen, but it meant that whilst I was in London, I was spending most of my time in Scotland, working in Scotland. So I never really tried to explore the London market because I was away all the time. So yeah, I mean, I guess one thing to say is that my career has never really been planned. It's just kind of happened to me.
Yeah.
And I'm very kind of instinctively driven about when I do have choices to make, at that moment where there is which one of these shows should I do? I'm probably driven mainly by the challenge. So do I think that show will challenge me? Do I think that show will stretch me? Rather than by a kind of longer term. If I do that show, I might be here in 5 years, or if I do that show.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question that's just come in here. How long do you hold on to a light and design idea if it wasn't what the director was expecting? Mix of your design and how you would light it / what they had in mind.
Ooh. Too long.
Come round to your way of thinking.
Yes, yeah. You just keep showing it to them. I think it depends. It depends on why.
It was from Jack, by the way.
It depends on where you are in the process. So I think if the lights are already rigged and hung and focused, I might keep trying to get them into the show and maybe change the color in them in case that wasn't the thing that was quite right. Or if they're there, then I probably hang on to the idea for slightly longer. If it's still in the development stages, still in rehearsal, nothing's been committed to on the plan, I probably do throw ideas away pretty frequently.
Yeah. Do you try and troubleshoot them? Do you I sometimes find that you put, you turn the light on, that in your head is this fantastic idea, here come the Oliviers, and they go, oh, it's awful, or I hate it, and I sort of try and then go, oh, okay, what is it you don't like? Is it the colour? Is it the angle? Is it, rather than just being like, oh, it's gone then.
Well, I do totally try and work that out, because I think even if it doesn't help get that light back into the show, it's good for, removing the other 20 lights that you're now not going to show them because it actually turns out that they hate green.
Yeah.
So I think it is that process. It's a continuation of that process of getting into somebody's head where you're going, what is it you actually want to see? I mean, I did a show earlier this year where there was a big system of top light rigged, which I thought made the space look amazing. And the director saw it on and went, sorry, it's just not me.
Oh no.
You just go, right, well, let's scratch those off the touring plan.
Yes, I'm glad we spent that focus time.
Yeah. I'm glad I made that exactly perfectly lined up in every single unit. And that was a director I'd worked with before. So I think, I think it's slightly instinct. Kind of get the idea of the things that you can maybe push and the things that you definitely should just retire.
I don't know why I'm not talking. I had a tent show. Jack can't speak at the minute because he's at work. That's why I'm reading this out. That's good. Thank you. I had a tent show at uni when it was hard to keep hold of my idea, but never experienced it again in the real world since. Thank you. Yeah, it's a horrible, horrible moment, isn't it? When you you feel like you've really put all your effort into this thing. And you go, it really will serve the piece. Please trust me. Can we at least try it? And they just go, no.
I mean, I think sometimes you discover what the piece is. So I did a show called Meet Me at Dawn during the International Festival in Edinburgh a few years ago. which kind of all of us throughout the process discovered that the less we did, the stronger it ended up being. So I'd ended up with kind of a typical Traverse festival rig of about 80 units. The way it works when you're in an in-house show at the Traverse, you basically get their stock and you get first dibs on their stock and first dibs on rigging space. And yeah, during the technical process, we just kept turning stuff off and going, actually, that works better. So the show ended up being lit by, I think, 6 lusters and a VL3000, and that was it. And everybody did that. The sound kept getting pared back. The acting kept getting, toned down. So that was a really interesting process. That it was just that what we thought we were making, didn't serve the piece as well as the thing that we ended up making. And just being alive to that and not going, because I've got all of these great things in the air, we should use them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if they don't serve it, there's no point, is there? I mean, you've got stuff for no reason. I forgot, Chris, that you can see these questions. Did you have a breakthrough moment from technician to designer as a profession?
Not a so I don't think there was a single moment. I was never really a theatre technician. So I didn't I did a bit at the Traverse when I was a student, but I did most of my technical work in corporate. And I think that's actually quite a useful divider, because I think there's a tendency for a lot of people to think of you as a technician if they see you in venues as a technician, whereas I had the benefit that I was doing my technician thing somewhere else. It was, so I would say, I think there were probably some shows that put me more on the map, but it was kind of a stepping stone through those shows. So I'd say Slick definitely made a splash when it happened in Scotland, which was not Vox Motus' first show, but the show that kind of put them on the map. It was the first one that I lit for them. And I think at that point, people started taking interest in what I was doing, and I certainly got asked about more things. I would say the infamous Brothers Davenport, another Vox Motus show, which I did at the Lyceum, opened the door for me to that building, and I had a very, very good relationship with that building. Dragon, obviously, opened a load of doors for me internationally, as I've described. Bondagers at the Lyceum also got me. That was the first show that I did that won an award, where I actually got to go to an award ceremony and pick it up. And there was certainly doubt. That was probably the first point where I started having directors saying, we'd like to meet you, not about a specific project, but just to come in and have a chat and to have kind of a general. And it was, there were 2 building-based directors in particular who kind of reached out to me after that, which again felt that was kind of moving up the ladder. But nothing that I would say was kind of, I don't know. I've never really had that. This show has made me, which also means that I don't kind of have that thing of, the pressure on the show. This show could be the one that makes or breaks me.
Yeah. It's quite a nice pressure not to have, though. That's
yeah. I mean, I think there is always that thing of you're only as good as your last show. But yeah, I think slow and steady is, I guess, the way to describe my career.
Sure. I hope that's sort of what you're after, Fred. Thank you for that. I have sort of one last question before we try and sort of wrap up, if nothing else comes through. But you said there that one of the first things that you did with Vox Motus was what meant people started, it became what you did. How did you actually meet, presumably Jamie, but how did you meet the team?
So that was, it was the National Theatre of Scotland event that I mentioned. So they were doing, so I don't know if anybody's ever been to Improbable's Devoted and Disgruntled, which they do every year in London. So it was a similar event to that, which they organised for the National Theatre of Scotland in Vicky's first year as artistic director. and Jamie and Candice were both there, and I was there. And the way that event kind of works is that there are lots of little discussions that you can dip in and out of. And we kept finding ourselves in the same discussions and talking, and got to talking outside of one of those discussions about the kind of theatre that we liked and the kind of theatre that we wanted to make. I'd not actually seen anything that they'd done, so they invited me to come and see How to Steal a Diamond, which was the show that they were touring at that point. So I went to see that, really liked it. We all loved Robert Lepage's work, and Lip Sync was happening at Northern Stage, so we went to Northern Stage and saw Lip Sync. And from that was when they said, will you come and do a development with us? And it was initially a development. And then during that development, Jamie got to talking about Slick and said, would you be interested in lighting Slick? And actually Slick ended up happening before Bright Black. So the development was for Bright Black, and Slick was happened the year before. And kind of from that point, they've been very willing to push me as part of the team that delivers the shows. So I've been able to benefit very much from their success.
Brilliant, thank you. I know, sorry, you did touch on that right at the start, but I just brilliant. We've got nothing else trickling through, so I'm going to do one last thing that I'm lovingly calling Before You Go, which is 5 sort of quickfire-esque questions.
Yeah.
One production you'd love to revisit?
Recently, I'd love to get a chance to do Magic Flute again. I'd love a chance for more people to see Magic Flute, which is kind of ridiculous, because it played 5 nights in a 3,000 seat venue, sold out every night. So that's probably more people.
Right. Yeah.
Quite a lot of shows that I've done, but it just feels, it feels that show could have been seen by more people. So yeah, I'd love to revisit that. Yeah.
Brilliant. What is your guilty pleasure music choice?
I don't know. My music taste is pretty terrible. A guilty pleasure. I am partial to a bit of Runrig.
Oh yes, brilliant. That's
probably is a guilty pleasure.
Yeah. 3 words that people might use to describe your work.
Blue and amber.
Brilliant. Fantastic. One top tip when drawing a plan.
One top tip when drawing a plan. Put something on it.
Do you know what? Inspirational, Simon.
So in all seriousness, I find that I can spend hours procrastinating about putting the first light on the plan. So I should perhaps be more specific, because it occurs to me that maybe sounded like a facetious answer. I spend hours procrastinating about my first light. Okay. And then I find once I've put that first light on, everything flows more easily. Okay. So what I started trying to do now is just put anything on it. And then you're no longer staring at a blank piece of paper. And it's so easy just to delete the first thing you put on. But I find that really unblocks when I'm drawing.
Just gets it going. That's brilliant. And my final question, and I'm going to ask everybody this question.
Yeah.
If you had to write an autobiography right now, what would the title be?
Hiding in the Dark.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Well, unless anyone has any other questions, that is us. Thank you so much for your time. It's been fantastic speaking to you. I hope everyone has enjoyed listening. Yes, hopefully you'll see as it goes on how we get on with everyone else. And really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.